135 years ago, on April 23rd, 1891, the world's navies were put on notice. The Battle of Caldera Bay was a brief, small battle that had little impact on a brief and nearly forgotten war. And yet the first time that a modern armored naval vessel was sunk by a self-propelled torpedo was an event that still reverberates through naval doctrine today. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
The Chilean Civil War of 1891 started as a conflict between the president, José Manuel Emiliano Balmejeda, elected in 1886, and the National Congress. Over time, Balmejeda had lost the general support of Congress, leading to a stalemate over cabinet appointments and a standoff over the budget. It was a complex disagreement, raising questions over the Constitution, the power of Congress versus the president, and involving allegations of fraud against the president and that Congress was serving international nitrate interests. The standoff became more critical as a new national election approached. Maurice H. Hervey, a special correspondent of the London Times, explained, Chilean law does not permit the re-election of the president. The main dispute was over the question, who should be Balmejeda's successor? This is usually the question on which South American revolutions are born and bred. The standoff came to a head in January 1891. In opposition to the president, the Congress had withheld the budget for the year. In response, Balmejeda merely asserted that the previous budget would carry over, essentially bypassing Congress. Congress responded with a majority voting to depose the president, and Balmejeda then declared congressional leaders and their naval commander, José Mont Alvarez, to be traitors. But there was an interesting wrinkle. The bulk of the army stayed loyal to the president, but most of the Navy rebelled and served the congressional forces. The president thus had an army without a fleet, and the Congress had a fleet without an army. Both sides moved quickly to rectify their respective weaknesses. The New York Times noted after the war, the rebellion of the Chilean fleet robbed the government of Balmejeda of every available seagoing vessel, and the coast of Chile was practically lost to the government. Balmejeda, realizing his advantage on land, immediately called up a force of 40,000 troops. But his forces, sometimes called Balmejedists, but also sometimes called Gobernerists, meaning supporters of the government, held some hope of keeping control of powerful naval vessels that were at the time being built in Europe, including the impressive battleship Captain Prat. Shipyards agreed to rush production, but it would take time for any of those vessels to be completed and returned to Chilean waters. However, two vessels were near completion and dispatched to serve the president, the torpedo gunboats Almirante Condal and Almirante Lynch. These vessels were rather small, 229 foot 8 inches long and 26 foot 3 inches at the beam, displacing 702 long tons. They were new, constructed in Laird Brothers Shipyard in Birkenhead, UK, on a design used by the Royal Navy, the Sharpshooter class. Completed in January, the two vessels arrived in Valparaiso in March. The development of the self-propelled torpedo by British naval engineer Robert Whitehead in 1866 had resulted in the development of new naval doctrine. A torpedo launched from a relatively small and inexpensive ship or boat could potentially sink a major naval vessel. Navies began to outfit tiny vessels, outfitted with torpedoes, called torpedo boats. In 1878, a Whitehead torpedo, launched by a Russian torpedo boat, had sunk the Ottoman-armed merchant steamer Entebbe. While the vessel was not a modern armored warship, the result had not only confirmed the utility of torpedo boats, but had spurred navies to develop responses to them. One response had been the deployment of steel torpedo nets, heavy steel nets suspended by booms intended to protect a ship at rest, assuming any torpedo fired would be caught by the net. Another response was to create another class of vessel, larger than the tiny torpedo boats, but smaller than armored cruisers, designed for speed. These boats' primary purpose was to intercept and destroy the torpedo boats. Moreover, navies realized that these types of vessels, faster than larger warships, could also be armed with torpedoes, making them both offensive and defensive in nature. Eventually, this would lead to a fast, maneuverable, multi-role vessel called a torpedo boat destroyer, or in short, the destroyer. The Almirante Condal and Almirante Lynch represented a transition period before the full development of the class would eventually become an important part of every modern fleet. Rather than torpedo boat destroyers, they were known as torpedo gunboats. Each was outfitted with 5 Whitehead torpedo tubes, 1 4 and 2 each broadside, as well as 3 3-inch 12-pounder guns and 3 3-pounder Hotchkiss guns, smallish naval guns, but sufficient for attacking torpedo boats. They were steel-hulled, had a ram on the prow, and described as having a relatively high forecastle and poop. Their 2 triple-expansion steam engines allowed a relatively fast 20 knots. The crew complement was around 90 men. The Congress, sometimes referred to as the insurrectionists, immediately sought to raise their own army among their supporters. These efforts would lead to a diplomatic confrontation with the United States in May, as the U.S., technically neutral and generally supportive of Almageda, refused to allow a vessel with arms purchased in the United States for the insurrectionist army to sail. But in the short run, Congress had a significant advantage with their fleet. Included in the fleet was the flagship, commanded by Mott himself, the Blanco Encalada. Referred to as a central battery ship, the Encalada was a modern ironclad frigate. Though relatively short, at 210 feet, her beam was 20 feet wider than the torpedo gunboats, and she displaced 3,480 long tons, more than 3 times the displacement of one of Balmaheda's gunboats. The term central battery ship meant the vessel's battery was concentrated in the center of the ship and built for broadside. The vessels were described as a development of the casemate ironclads of the U.S. Civil War, but had a much higher freeboard. She had a significant armored belt. It mounted 6 9-inch rifles, as well as 20-pounder, 9-pounder, and 7-pounder guns. Built at Earl's Shipbuilding Company in Hull and launched in 1875, the vessel had served as a flagship of the Chilean Armada in the 1879 to 1881 War of the Pacific against the Navy of Peru, one of the earliest conflicts to define the power of modern steam-powered armored vessels. She had participated in the climactic October 8, 1879 Battle of Angamos and had captured the Peruvian gunboat Pilcomayo. The Times wrote, "Immediately upon the arrival of the Condell and Lynch at Valparaiso, Captain Morega and Fuentes undertook to place them in readiness for action. It was found necessary to fit a number of new boiler tubes, and this work was completed in 3 weeks' time. By the middle of April, the 2 commanders were cruising the coast." On April 22nd, the Blanco Encalada was moored in Caldera Bay, having escorted several transports. The transports had landed several troops and had been accompanied by the Blanco Encalada's captain, Louis Gagny. The Times wrote, "In his absence, no apprehension was entertained of any attack from Balmaheda's vessels. It is asserted, however, that Captain Gagny was aware that the Cordell and Lynch were in the neighborhood. The larger vessel was laying at anchor. Her fires were banked, meaning that the coals were covered to reduce consumption of coal. Her watertight bulkhead doors were not closed, and her torpedo nets had been left on shore. Many of her most experienced crew had gone ashore with the naval detachment, and of the 248 men and 26 officers aboard, the Times reported, only around 80 were trained, with the rest mostly inexperienced recruits. It's not clear exactly why the Blanco Encalada crew were not better prepared. The Times suggests that, curious as it may seem, a number of congressional naval officers actively entertained the idea that no Chilean officer would sink a Chilean ironclad. Morega and Fuentes, the Times notes, would soon disabuse their minds. The attack was described in detail by a Lieutenant Marquise aboard the Encalada and reported in the New York World. Early on the morning of April 23rd, the 3rd officer of the Encalada, Lieutenant Marquise, was upon the bridge when the lookout called his attention to a light to seaward on the ironclad's port. In a moment it disappeared, and it was surmised, as events proved, that it was the searchlight of the government torpedo boat Condell. Half an hour afterwards, the clouds obscuring the moon cleared away, and the officer saw 2 small vessels, not more than half a mile away, both bearing down upon the ironclad. One was the Almirante Condell, coming on from the southwest, while the Almirante Lynch approached from the northwest. Captain Gagny recalled initial confusion. The morning was dull and cloudy, the moon at intervals being completely obscured. At about 4 a.m., the torpedo vessels were sighted by the lookout man at a distance of about 2,000 yards. The alarm was at once given, but some delay took place in getting the people to their quarters, owing to the bugler mistaking the orders and sounding the ordinary reveille instead of the call for action. Marquise reported that the Encalada was caught unawares. She was at anchor, and her fires were banked so that she could not have been able to get up steam enough to turn around, even had her anchors been up. The alarm was immediately sounded, and the current officers took up their positions to repel the attack. The Condell came bow on, and as soon as she was within range, fired a torpedo, which, however, missed its mark. At the same time, the torpedo boat opened fire with her Hotchkiss gun, which, being on a pivot, could be turned in every direction. The Almirante Lynch, which had slowed down as she approached the man-of-war, also made use of her Hotchkiss gun, when almost bows on. The Encalada answered, but owing to her disabled condition, could not do much damage. The first serious calamity was caused by a shell from the Blanco Encalada, which carried away some of the Almirante Lynch's fore rigging, and as the government boat was as much exposed, she took up a new position to starboard of the ironclad, where she fired a torpedo, which, like the Condell, missed its aim. The Blanco Encalada replied with a heavy fire, but the Lynch maneuvered quickly and was difficult to hit. She soon fired another torpedo, which, like the others, missed, going 100 yards astern. The insurgent sailors fought with all the energy of which they were capable of, being fully alive to the terrible danger. Every shot at the smaller government vessels was carefully aimed, but the steel armor of the torpedo vessels turned aside the shot and shell. The Condell fired 2 more torpedoes. Both went wide of the mark, and in return the Blanco Encalada landed a shell from one of her heaviest guns onto the deck of the Condell, killing 4 men and shattering her smokestack on the starboard side. The Almirante Lynch was busy with her Hotchkiss gun, which tore the rigging of the Blanco Encalada to tatters, smashing her boats and playing havoc with her upper works. The dead and wounded lay upon the Encalada's decks, which were slippery with blood. Her sailors fought bravely, and though the Lynch sent 2 more torpedoes in her direction, the explosives went wide of their mark. Altogether, the Lynch ejected 4 torpedoes at the Encalada, without effect. The engagement was already showing the limitation of the Whitehead torpedoes, which had no way to aim except by pointing the ship, and whose compressed air engines did not always run true. The gunboats had fired 4 torpedoes at a ship that could not maneuver, and yet had scored no hits. But that would change. Marquise reported, the officers of the Lynch now determined to make a supreme effort. Her flag was run up to the peak, and her Hotchkiss gun became silent. She worked around till she was now on the starboard side of the Encalada, and there was a swish from the tube in the Lynch's ram. The Encalada got her searchlights on the approaching missile as she had on the other 4, and her gunners poured a leaden rain onto it for the purpose of sinking it. This time, however, the aim of the torpedo was true, and the storm of shot from the Encalada failed to destroy. The steel torpedo net also failed to divert messenger of destruction, so sudden and unexpected was the attack. The torpedo struck the Encalada, just abaft of the foremast, and a deafening explosion followed. A huge hole yawned in her starboard side, extending a little below the waterline, and the ironclad filled quickly. This was not an unarmored Ottoman armed merchant, but a modern armored ship of war. The attack had begun at approximately 4 a.m. Captain Morega of the Lynch later reported that from the discharge of the Cordell's first torpedo to the discharge of the Lynch's second, about 7 minutes elapsed. Marquise described the effects of the explosion. The doomed ironclad's men scrambled into the boats, hanging upon the rear davits. Both the Condell and the Lynch now opened fire from the Hotchkiss guns, and scores of men were killed while attempting to escape. Many of the sailors sprang into the water only to meet death by drowning or by being eaten by sharks, with which the bay abounds. The ironclad quickly settled, and with a sudden lurch went down in less than 3 minutes, with her officers and crew. The Times reported those who witnessed the destruction of the Blanco Encalada say the affair was all over before they were fully aware to realize what had happened. The lightning-like attack, the unearthly crash of the Hotchkiss guns, the explosion of the torpedoes all followed in quick succession. Marquis reported that out of 200 men, only 12 escaped. Among the latter was Captain Gagné, who sprang overboard and, escaping the sharks, swam to the Caldera beach, where he was rescued in an exhausted state. The Times reported that Captain Gagné, worn out by the fatigue of the day's work, did all that any man could have done, and his vessel heeled over and sank. He was among the last to spring into the water. When daylight appeared an hour later, the Times reported, all that could be seen of the proud Blanco Encalada were the tops of the bridges. The Condell and Lynch were nowhere in sight. She was a source of great pride to all Chileans. Her loss was deeply deplored. The first sinking of a modern, ironclad ship of war by a small torpedo vessel was noticed by navies around the world, but how significant was the victory really? While much larger, the Blanco Encalada was unable to maneuver, making her central battery design ineffective. She also did not have her torpedo nets deployed, had an inexperienced crew, and was caught unaware. A similar attack on the Encalada's sister, the Almirante Cochrane, was easily avoided as the ship simply withdrew from torpedo range. Still, Peruvian naval officer Alberto Jimenez noted in a 1961 edition of the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute Press that it was significant that an armored vessel of 3,499 tons had been sunk in a matter of minutes by 2 craft of 750 tons each, both of which were intact after the operation.
In the end, the Battle of Caldera Bay had little impact on the Chilean Civil War of 1891. The loss of the Blanco Encalada did weaken the insurrectionist position, but in the end, Balmaheda's troops were defeated on land. The war was over, and Balmaheda was dead by mid-September. But the world's navies took note. They better trained for torpedo attacks. They became more diligent about putting up their torpedo netting, and they built large fleets of torpedo boats, torpedo boat destroyers, and a new technology, the submarine, in order to take advantage of the self-propelled torpedo. Naval tactics changed as well. British naval expert William Laird Claus concluded that torpedo attacks work best when done by surprise. It is a lesson that would be applied in the world wars to come among fleets that had been transformed because of the brief and nearly forgotten naval battle of Caldera Bay. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.